My name is Anna Brones, and I am a writer and an artist, and most of the art that I do is paper cut illustration. So it's all illustrations that are cut from one single piece of paper. I really like paper cutting because it's a very simple art form. I mean, really all you need is a piece of paper and something to cut it with. Paper cutting started in China, and there's lots of paper cutting traditions around the world. And I just get a lot of satisfaction out of teaching paper cutting because I think there is this element to having a really simplified medium. So you're really only playing with positive and negative space. You don't have any colors that you're working with. I mean, you can choose a color of paper, but you know, this is made out of black paper. So all that I'm working with is the black paper and the white paper. So it really challenges you to think differently. And every time I teach, I think at the end of the class people feel really tired, mostly because it takes a lot of brain power to rethink what you're going to cut out, what you're going to leave in, how to keep everything connected. And so I think that in terms of materials, very simple, but then it can be really complex once you get into it. I started doing this probably about 6 years ago, I think. I'm all self-taught. I don't even remember exactly how I started. I do know that I'm a cyclist, and I used to take old bike inner tubes from the bike tires when I would get a flat, and I would use an X-Acto knife, I would clean them off, and then I would use an X-Acto knife to cut them and make earrings out of them. And then at one point I was making a birthday card or something for someone, and I happened to have the X-Acto knife and the cutting mat sitting on my table, and I had a piece of paper, so I thought, oh, I'll just cut the piece of paper and make a birthday card. So I use a scalpel. Some people paper cut artists use scissors. I do not. I just like the precision of the knife. Everything is drawn onto the piece of paper. And then at the end, because I don't want to see the pencil marks, I turn the paper cut over. So any of my work that has words in it is all written backwards. And I worked on a lot of words over the last couple of years because I worked on a series called Women's Wisdom Project, which was 100 different women, all profiles, portraits of inspiring women kind of throughout history and modern, and they all featured a quote. So I got really sick of cutting letters. And that show opened up on Vashon Island in March, and was open for about 5 days before all of those ladies were quarantined in the gallery. I grew up here on the Key Peninsula. My great-grandparents homesteaded out here, so my family's been around for a long time. I moved back home here about 5 years ago, and I not only make art here, but I also sometimes teach through Two Waters after-school program at the middle school. I've taught every year. I'll be doing an online version of that class in August, which is fun, and I think it's important for anybody to have access to creativity, really. I think that we tend to think of creativity and art as only for self-identified artists, and I would say that creativity is really essential to anyone, whatever they're doing. It's really interesting to look at how your work evolves over time. So a lot of my paper cuts, if they're not framed, I have them in just portfolio binders. And I pulled this one because this one I made a few years ago. And this was a collaborative project that I did with some women who fish up in Alaska, and they run a company called the Salmon Sisters. And so they wanted to do a series of cards that honored the process of fishing. And so this is one of them that I did that was inspired by that. And I remember at the time that this was one of the more complicated pieces that I'd done because there was a lot of kind of work in the net and stuff. And I just have I have yet to frame this piece, but I have held on to it because I just really like it, and it's kind of a special piece for me. I can look at this now and notice that this is a bit structurally unsound here in this section because there's a lot cut out, but you can see that the whole thing just holds together. I'm a writer. I've done some cookbooks, and I do a lot of food writing. So I also publish a small little zine called Comestible. And so this is one of the paper cuts that I made for the cover. So it's just kind of a variety of seasonal summer produce. For myself, made this list of things that I think fuel creativity, because I've been writing a monthly newsletter for the last 2 years called Creative Fuel. And so I came up with this list of 20 things that help to spark creativity and help to sustain creativity. And so I put them all into this piece. So it's things like be open, practice, take breaks. So there's a lot of text in this one. And I actually like this one because it's a lot of detail, but it holds just kind of that original size and shape of the paper. That's why I've yet to frame this one too, because I just like holding it. This is a bigger piece that I made more recently. This is just in the last couple of months. So in the time of COVID and also social and civic unrest, I've been thinking a lot about the meaning of art and the purpose of art. And I think for me, I always want to create pieces that either spark somebody to think differently or to maybe feel a certain emotion. And so this one, it says at the bottom, kindness stems from the smallest seeds. So I think that we're in a moment where often we can all feel a little powerless. And I think that kindness is one of those things that we all have the power to give on an everyday basis, and to remind ourselves that that can be done in even small ways, and that even small seeds lead to big growth. This is one of my Women's Wisdom project pieces. It's Ida B. Wells. And the quote that I chose for this one, so this is part of the series where I did 100 different women, all with different quotes. So this one was, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them," which I thought was very powerful. Thinking a lot about sort of the time that we're in, and there's a lot of uncertainty, but also that uncertainty is kind of our only constant and really the contributor to us growing. So I made this piece which says we are always growing, as sort of an honor to the fact that we're always growing and shifting, evolving, and that's a really important part of being human. The rules of creativity, number one, there are no rules. I keep meaning to hang this up by my desk, but I made this one really fast too, so I see all of the mistakes in it, but I actually kind of like it because I think it sort of feels like a piece of paper that maybe you would have in elementary school that you're kind of scribbling on, so it's probably good that it's not perfect. Nothing's perfect anyway. This is where I do my paper cutting. Fortunately, my husband built me this stand-up thing, because before I used to sit and I would just hunch over and I'd basically throw out my back all the time. So like I said, paper, something to cut with, and then I use a pencil and an eraser to draw what I'm going to cut. And then I use just a craft cutting mat to cut into. So what I was going to show is two basic elements of paper cutting. So I'm going to cut a tree, and so I'm going to show you two different ways to cut a tree. So I'll just draw a little tree here. Actually, probably don't need to draw that, but okay. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it out. So with paper cutting, you always want to cut towards yourself, or you want to pull the blade towards yourself, which is a little counterintuitive because that's not what we learn when we're little about knives. But it allows for more control of the knife. So I end up moving the paper a lot when I'm cutting. So I can pull that out. So let's grab a white piece of paper. So that's the first thing we can do, is cut the tree out. Now, because we've cut the tree out, it also means that we have the silhouette of the tree. So you can kind of see the two together. So this is kind of the base aspect of paper cutting. Now, if I'm going to do the same tree, the other element, or the other thing that I can do is I can cut detail into that tree. So what I mean by detail is maybe some smaller components that create the shape of the tree, like these branches. when I end up with a lot of small pieces of paper all over my studio. So I have to vacuum quite regularly. So this is a tree. Turn this over. So this is a tree where we've created the shape of the tree by cutting detail with the tree. Now, when paper cutting gets more elaborate, we're kind of combining all of those elements. And I mentioned earlier that in my paper cuts, everything is held together. So if you've done any collage, you know that you cut and then glue things down. So I almost always only have one piece of paper involved, which means that everything has to connect. So for example, let's say that we want to do a tree with a moon behind it. So I'll just draw in a tree here, and then I'm going to put in this moon kind of behind. Now what I have to decide is, am I cutting, is this going to be the silhouette, kind of more like this little tree that we cut out? Is there going to be detail in the tree? Is the moon going to be black? Is it going to be white? There's sort of like a lot of decisions that you end up having to make. And this is why when you start in paper cutting, your brain is always on because you're trying to envision what you want to do. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut this so that it ends up a little bit more like this one, that kind of silhouette. And I'm basically putting the top of the tree into the corner of this moon or sun, since we not putting too many other elements in this, so we don't know if it's daytime or nighttime, but that's just up to the viewer to decide. So you can see this tree starting to take shape in that moon. Maybe I want like a little tiny bit of detail in this moon. Maybe I just want a little simple line that shows the crescent. So I'm going to follow along here on the edge. I always, in my paper cuts, even if I have drawn it, I always draw, and it's pretty rare that I entirely freehand. But even when I do have my whole piece planned out, I always end up doing something that I didn't plan for, because I think that paper cutting really is an art form of just like letting go of expectation, because something always happens that you didn't plan for regardless, because you cut something wrong. But I do like to sort of add different elements. Okay, so now we have that moon shape is kind of starting to come into form. So now I'm just going to cut out the whole silhouette. So I'm going to cut around the moon. And sometimes I have to come back in and do some additional drawing because I kind of lose where I'm going. When I teach too, I always tell students it's good to start with the most detailed stuff first and then work your way out. Because if I cut here and cut detail first, that piece of paper can kind of hold its own. It's really hard to start cutting detail into like a small piece of paper once you've cut it out. And then we carefully pull this out. And then there we have a tree with the moon behind it. So that's kind of what you start playing with when you do a paper cut. So now if I kind of wanted this as consider this a practice element for a bigger piece, then it would maybe think about what else I would want to add. So maybe there's lots of trees and the moon. Maybe there's lots of trees and the moon is here, which means that there's shadow down here. And then how am I creating that shadow? Am I cutting? Maybe I cut out maybe I leave the bottom black and then cut out the shapes of these like long trees kind of in the shadow. So there's so many options. So you just start playing with it and then you keep experimenting, which I think is probably what any artist really loves about their art, is just playing around and seeing what works.